Hello, everybody. This is Rick Manning, President of Americans for Limited Government. And, folks, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but our nation is in trouble. And we've got further evidence of that as the inflation numbers came out today. And to no one's surprise, inflation continues to rampage through our economy. The inflation rate is at 8.2% nationally. That's year over year. And what that means very simply is that things you bought overall are about 8% more expensive today than they were a year ago. Now, the problem with that is that your wages didn't go up by 8%, and real wages, which is a combination of real average weekly wages, which is a combination of the amount of the average raise that people have received over the course of the last year, plus how many hours they typically work. So, how much money are they making on a per hour basis? The average person is making about 3.5% less money now in terms of real spending power than they were a year ago. So Americans on average have taken a 3.5% Biden haircut on their income, on their purchasing power of their dollars, because even if you got 5% increase, if you're in your wages, if inflation's 8.2%, you end up with 3.2. The fact is, you end up with adding in a bunch of things that Bureau of Labor Statistics does, and they came up with 3.5% being the real average weekly wage decline over the last year. Bad news for a president who wants to claim we're not in a recession. Americans are feeling the costs, even with the price at the pump. For this particular report, they collect the data. The way these things work is they collect the data and then they analyze the data. It takes some time. And so this is the report for September, but the data was collected before the recent bump, about 25 cent bump on average on a gallon of gas. And so it doesn't reflect the recent price increases on a gallon of gas that we're all paying, but it's not included in this inflation number. So, it's bad news ahead. And the fact of the matter is the Democrats are, politically, let's just face it. The Democrats are really stuck here because they've overseen this. They're the ones who engaged in a fiscal policy which flooded the economy with money at a time when the economy didn't need to be flooded with money, and set the inflationary fire going. And the fact of the matter is, we have a massive problem now because inflation has now worked itself into the everyday products that exist, because believe it or not, inflation minus things like energy and food this past year to year is up about a little over 6%. And so that means that every aspect of our economy has seen prices going up. And so there's no way to escape it. I want to go to something here and show you let's see here. How do I do this? Got it. Okay. This is an article in Breitbart that was up today, and they went through and they broke out. And this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics does this. This is what Breitbart doing any great research. This is just them copying and pasting off the Bureau of Labor Statistics data on both the producer price index and the consumer price index, which have come out the last 2 days. But things like, you want to talk about food prices and how that affects people who are struggling in terms of making ends meet. Things like cheese is up 13.4% over year to year. Ice cream. Now this is personal. This is getting personal. They're talking about ice cream. Ice cream is 13.6% more expensive today than it was a year ago. Fruits and veggies, 10.4%. Potatoes up 1.8% August to September, but 17.5% compared with a year ago. And so I heard on the radio a couple of days ago somebody talking about this, and they were kind of saying, I don't understand why a potato or a tomato, their price should go up on did it cost more to manufacture a potato? And they were kind of joking around about it, but the fact of the matter is it did cost more to manufacture a potato. And let me tell you how that works. A farmer back in February, March had to decide if they were going to plant fields of potatoes. How many fields were they going to plant? How much yield were they hoping to get? Which fields could they not afford to plant because the cost of actually tilling the ground and using the tractors with a high cost of diesel was too high to justify the amount of profit they were going to make from the potatoes that ground was going to produce. So some fields went fallow and were not planted to produce potatoes. I was told this by a potato farmer in Idaho 6 months ago. And so some fields weren't planted. So fewer potatoes were grown. And the cost of growing those potatoes, because diesel fuel was dramatically higher in cost, the cost of producing those potatoes was much higher. Because the cost of diesel fuel was so high, the cost of transporting those potatoes from Idaho to your market was much higher. The cost of labor for the people who handled the potatoes was much higher because of those costs, and that being figured into their salaries. The truckers had to charge more money for trucking because of all those costs. So what we see is a snowball effect. You have fewer potatoes produced, which means there's a supply on the supply side, there's less potatoes. You have the potatoes that are produced cost more money to produce those potatoes. And same thing with eggs, same thing with, obviously eggs are chickens, but the chicken feed and the like are costly. I didn't even go into the cost of fertilizer, which has gone up because of environmental regulations by the Biden administration. The cost of water is up in most places. So you have the cost of pesticides are up, and many pesticides can't be used now. So more expensive pesticides have to be used. And the pesticides that the Biden administration want farmers to use are less efficient, cutting crop yields. So once again, fewer potatoes. So that's how in a holistic approach, when you look at the economy as a whole, you had a higher cost at the actual grower for the grower. You had because of higher costs, they didn't grow as many potatoes. You had a higher cost to transport them. And so you had a higher cost for you at the grocery store and at McDonald's where you buy Happy Meal or something to get your fries. So that's kind of how the supply chain works and how it affects things like eggs, tomatoes, potatoes. Lettuce was up 15.7%. Same deal. Sugar and sweets up 14.4% compared to a year ago. We talked about ham. Ham was up 2.1% from August to September. And it was about at the average inflation rate, 8.1% compared with a year ago. Cakes, for all of us who like to eat cake and, Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake and all that. But for those Democrats who want us to eat cake, just understand it's 16% more expensive now than it was before. So those are some of the things that, when you deal with foodstuffs, that's where your costs get built in. And when Joe Biden, about 6-7 months ago, tried to encourage farmers to plant more of their fields, he was doing so while putting policies into place that directly discouraged them from doing so. He didn't open up land, which has been storehoused by the federal government that is fallow, that could have been produced, could have been tilled and farmed. He didn't open up that land for farming. He didn't give farmers an incentive to use it. So they've taken land off the market for farming, and they didn't open it up. Consequently, that's land that didn't produce food. So you want to know how it all works. Ultimately, government has a giant role in this because government is who makes the costs for a farmer go up, and in some ways determines what land can and cannot be tilled and farmed. And in doing so, ultimately you pay the price because, folks, the potatoes don't come from the grocery store. Potatoes come from the ground, and somebody has to plant them and somebody has to harvest them and somebody has to transport them. And ultimately that's why we have a higher cost of food. I want to look at a couple of the things here. I'm going to look at here, Florida Girl. For the last 10 plus, food has been the best investment. I've kept receipts from over a year so I can compare the gap price differential. Yeah, I think you can look at that and you can say, that's uh, in everybody's personal lives. So one of the things that a lot of people do, and it gets kind of offset on this, because the inflation rate is based on a fixed market basket of food that you buy. And so what do? Suddenly you find yourself substituting uh, cheaper substitutes for different foodstuffs, and as a result, maybe you would have uh, what used to be steak. Everybody used to have steak, red meat all the time. So I'll use this example, but it's a bad one in today's world. Let's say you would have a pot roast once a week, which used to happen all the time, doesn't happen anymore. And instead, you have a casserole, a hamburger casserole. And maybe you used to use, 10% fat in your hamburger casserole. You're now using 80%, 20% fat in your hamburger because it's less expensive. And so there's lots of different choices people make. I'm not telling you all anything you don't know, but those things really aren't. Those are the things people naturally do when they're cutting back because of high prices. And every single person that's been in the grocery store has made those choices, going generic, not name brand. So there's ways to fix that for your own income. But bottom line is, we are in a world where inflation is real, inflation is continuing, and inflation is going to get worse. Um, the Something else that's occurred is that there's um, even the left wing apologist economists are saying, listen, this isn't Putin inflation. This is a supply chain inflation. This is a fiscal inflation. This is inflation that's buried into the system because of spending decisions made by the Biden administration, which lit the economy on fire and put so much money in the economy that too many dollars were competing for too few products. And as a result, the cost of those products went up, as they always do. And the problem here is that is exactly what the Federal Reserve is attempting to combat. And they're attempting to combat it by raising interest rates. And so, hence, and everybody knows this, but buying a new house, that 3% 30-year fixed you used to be able to get is now between 6 and 7%. You're looking at all sorts of additional, increased costs as a result of those interest rate increases. And from a national debt perspective, which people don't talk much about, but I will, since we're Americans for Limited Government, we have $31 trillion in national debt. What that means, if the interest rate that we have to pay on that national debt goes up by 1%, that's an additional $310 billion that we have to spend that's on interest alone. You don't get a single extra dollar going to Social Security. You don't get a single extra dollar going to defense, not a single extra dollar going to help homeless children be able to be fed. That's $310 billion, which is, by the way, it's about 1/6 of the discretionary budget of the budget that Congress actually decides how they're going to spend. $310 billion of just wasted money, just interest payments on the debt. So you don't pay down the debt at all. You still have 31 trillion, but 1% increase on that entire debt is $310 billion. The challenge here is that while the Treasury bills and the federal debt has not gone up nearly as much as one would have expected, because it's a marketplace and the rest of the countries in the world are, the dollar is still stronger than every other country in the world. And there's a flight to safety. And when there's a flight to safety in bad economic times, people buy dollars. But we still see a significant increase in the Treasury bills. And what those debts cost is costing the U.S. Treasury to sell our debt to the world. And because we were paying a very, very low interest rate on short-term debt just a year or 2 years ago, a lot of our debt that we've accumulated is packed into short-term debt instruments. which means we're having to roll over a lot of debt. Last year we rolled over about $7 trillion. From what I've read, this year we're doing about the same, and that means we're having to refinance debt. And in refinancing that debt, some of which came due, and some of which is new debt. But as we refinance the debt or buy new debt, we're having to buy it at 2% higher than we were before. And as a result, that's where you get your hit on the interest rates. You don't refinance the entire 31 trillion in one fell swoop. So while I use that example 310 is so you can understand it, it's not a hard and fast, because a lot of that debt is like in 10 and 30-year instruments. So they don't actually come due for a number of years. But the short-term debt is coming due, and the newly created debt is all due. And so, folks, that's where you're looking at a huge increase in the interest rate costs that nobody's accounting for. Another thing that's happening is we just had a notification that Social Security, the COLA for Social Security, increased cost of living adjustment for Social Security, is going to go up. I think it was 8.6%, but don't hold me to that. You can look it up. But they just announced that it was going to be, I think, 8.6% increase. What that means is Social Security, which is a massive budget item, we spend it. It's in the mandatory spend side of the budget. The amount we spent last year, all things being equal, is going to be 8.6% higher. Well, if that was $1 trillion, that means it's an extra $80 billion that we're going to spend on Social Security alone. So, and I don't know if it's $1 trillion. I'm just giving you an example. But so there's a lot of those things, and that's why once you get inflation going, it's really hard to stop, because suddenly you've got spending, you've got all these different things that people have cost of living adjustments automatically in their contracts. People who are trying to get new work agreements. People go to their bosses and say, "Hey, listen, I can't afford to. I've lost a lot of money here. The inflation's killing me. I need to have a raise. Inflation's 8.2%, and I need to have a raise that's at least 8.2%. And by the way, if you get that 8.2% raise, it means you didn't really get a raise. You're making the same amount of money as you did last year, at least at the beginning of the year. And so you didn't get a raise at all. What you actually got was you kept even with where you were a year ago. And most people are hoping to make more money in future years than they're making in the current year. So there's a lot of those things. And once you start seeing those kind of costs, labor costs being built into the system, at that point, you have to kill the economy to reconfigure everything. And that's why the interest rate's going up by the Fed. That's what the Federal Reserve is doing, is they're attempting to slow down the economy and effectively kill the economy, or at least make it comatose, so the system can reset. And it's really good from an economic standpoint. If you're a banker in New York, you can sit there and you can calibrate it and do the charts, saying, "Oh, isn't this wonderful?" But if you actually have to live in the world, it's painful. It's terrible. And so those are the kind of things that are happening. And it's a direct result of the Biden policies and the Democrat policies, which were keep spending. Robert Romano wrote a piece on this today in dailytorch.com, and I would commend it to everybody out there. Go to dailytorch.com and you can read it. You can see one of our old cartoons from Obama days, but it's still apropos. Keep shoveling the money into the engine, and maybe it'll fix. And that's actually the opposite. That's the problem, is we're actually shoveling too much money into the economy. And what Robert brings up here is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about two things. Electricity is up 15.5%. Utility pipe gas service up 33.1%. At a time when we are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, the natural gas prices, and this is partially because of Putin, because of Putin shutting down natural gas pipelines to Europe, and because of a lot of the environmentalists trying to stop building pipelines here domestically. We end up with, we see, even though we're awash in natural gas costs, piped gas service is up 33%, a massive increase. Electricity is up 15.5%. So all you out there are buying electric cars saying, gee whiz, I'm going to save on my gas. Well, guess what, folks? The electricity is up 15.5%, and the supply and demand world that we live in, that 15.5% is going to keep growing, because the more pressure we put on the grid, on the electrical grid, the higher the prices have to go, even with an electrical grid that's largely a socialized system. The prices have to go higher, because the only way that they can meet demand, or they can meet the supply in many places, is to make the prices high enough that the demand goes down. And so you're going to see continued upward pressure as more and more people opt for electric vehicles and other electric alternatives against the more cost-efficient fossil fuel choices. What's more, we have let's see here, there's one point I want to make. Oh, yeah. A real uh-oh is consumer credit. Consumer credit has skyrocketed in the last year. And what that means is the use of revolving credit and how much money you have on the credit card balance. And the credit card balance, on average, has gone up over 15% in America. So the average American has 15% more credit liability today than they did a year ago. And at some point, and that's how the consumer spending has been able to be maintained in spite of the higher prices. People are offsetting it while using their credit cards. And so what do you have? You have higher credit card debt. And once people are not able to max out those credit cards, at that point, they stop spending except for bare essentials. And that's when the consumer-driven inflation really hits rocky shores, which is good. The inflation goes down, but it's bad because that's when your economy collapses. We've got a consumer spending built economy, and if the consumers aren't spending anymore, it becomes problematic. And and when you see a skyrocketing inflation or consumer credit amount, revolving credit, it tells you that people are relying less on their income and more on their credit card. And the more they rely on plastic, the less they are income secure, and the more pain is caused if a job is lost, or if there's other problems, or that you get cut to part-time because suddenly the economy, there's not enough work to be full-time. I'm going to shift gears now to the energy side. And I'm going to shift gears to the energy side for a very specific reason. Joe Biden today or yesterday, at least somebody in his administration, said Saudi Arabians are going to have to pay a price. They're going to have to pay a price because of OPEC raising or cutting the production of oil, in spite of the fact that Joe Biden had gone on bended knee and asked for production to be increased, or at least remain stable through the election. And so the administration is now saying they're going to try to penalize Saudi Arabia. And I'm not going to get into the Middle East stuff here because that's a thing for a different day, but just understand Saudi Arabia is reacting to the fact that this administration has chosen Iran in a power struggle for in the Middle East. They've chosen the Iranian mullahs, and the Iranian mullahs want to dislodge the House of Saud from Saudi Arabia and replace them with a more fundamentalist government than even Saudi Arabia has. And as a result, because Saudi Arabia is the big prize, because both Mecca and Medina are there, two holiest shrines in all of Islam are in Saudi Arabia. And as a result, it's a huge prize. And so by the Biden administration, continuing to try to do a deal with Iran, and continuing to try to to kiss up to the mullahs in Iran. They are effectively have been pushing Saudi Arabia away from us the whole time. I know that the Biden administration knows this, but the U.S. dollar is really the world reserve currency because the Saudis choose to trade oil in the U.S. dollar. They require U.S. dollars to be used to purchase dollars. It's called petrodollar. And that's one of the things that stabilizes our currency. It's why we're a flight to safety. It's why we are paying lower interest rates for our treasury bills than we should, given the current inflation rate. And as a result, it's saving us hundreds of billions of dollars in interest payments on the debt because we're the world reserve currency, largely because the Saudis trade oil in dollars. If the Saudis open up the door to trade oil in yuan, in the Chinese yuan, or in the Japanese yen, or in the euro, or in the British pound, sterling pound, if they did that and said, we'll open it up to trading in all different currencies, at that point, demand for dollars goes down. Demand for dollars around the world goes down because they're not going to need dollars to actually purchase oil. Countries won't. Businesses in countries won't. And as a result, when the demand for the dollar goes down, the dollar will be, the cost to get people to purchase dollars will go up. And that's the lever that Saudi Arabia has over the United States. It's not a lever I like that they have. We can't ignore that. So when the Biden administration sits there and blithely says, oh, we're going to punish them, they're playing a dangerous game, playing an extremely dangerous game. And it's particularly ironic because the Biden administration wants Saudi Arabia to keep pumping more and more oil, and they won't allow us to pump oil here. They won't allow pipelines to be built. And we all know the Keystone XL pipeline is a simple example of importing Canadian oil from Alberta, Canada, from Calgary, down to America. They are discouraging petroleum processing, distillers now. So they're encouraging processing. We had the Chevron CEO months ago talk about how they're not going to be building any new refineries in the U.S. because the people don't want them. So when you see places like California say, oh, we're going to eliminate all gasoline-powered cars in 2035, what Chevron says is, well, does it make any sense to invest $1 trillion over 10 years to create a new refinery when there's not going to be a demand for gasoline from that refinery? Well, Chevron says it isn't. What's more, the bankers are saying to Chevron, you know what? We're not going. If you try to build new refineries, we're going to change your environmental, social, and governance score, and we're going to penalize you and make you a less valid investment. So the banking industry, which is embrace the environmentalist agenda, is sitting there and saying to a Chevron or anybody who wants to build a new petroleum refinery, that they will punish them and make it so their stock is less attractive and is not available to be purchased by certain investors because they would be deemed to be environmentally insensitive. So that's why you're not getting new refineries. And if you're not going to get new refineries, we can have all the oil in the world, but if we can't refine it into gas and we have to send it overseas to have it refined, we're nothing more than a third world country who, emptying our own natural resources out to ship those natural resources across the globe to have it refined and turned into something productive elsewhere and then shipped back to us, and having our own oil shipped overseas, refined and shipped back at a much higher cost is a problem we have with mining. Where we have not opened up, actually, that's not true. They just opened up a new one. We've opened up one new processing plant for, what are they called? Crushing the ore and basically taking ore and turning it into lead or other minerals and being able to extract those minerals. We've only had one of those kind of plants built in the United States, and that was in Las Vegas, Nevada, for a rare earth metal plant that Donald Trump pushed through and made happen in about a year. So we have a problem where we're not actually willing to refine or take our raw materials and turn them into finished goods, or at least usable materials. And because we're not willing to do that, because the environmentalists have made it so difficult to do that, we effectively ship our mined goods overseas. We ship our oil overseas to have it refined. That's, unless we increase refinery capacity, it's very hard to we can produce as much oil as we want to, but if we can't convert it to gasoline, it kind of becomes a moot point. So those are some of the things that are happening. Those are the pressures that are on inflation, and we've made decisions in this country that are putting us on a course of dependency, permanent dependency on countries that don't like us very much. And if you don't like inflation, and you don't like particularly inflation driven by high gas prices up front, high diesel prices up front, as I explained with the potatoes, you don't like that inflation, you think that's stupid, then we darn well better start refining oil produced here. We need to produce more oil here, and we need to refine the oil here. And so we're meeting the needs of our country and then exporting the excess raw material that we have to be refined and used elsewhere in the world. But if we're not willing to turn our raw material into gasoline, our oil out of the ground into gasoline, if we're not willing to do that because of environmental concerns or whatever, if we choose not to do that, expand existing refinery capacity, then we're condemning ourselves to a world where we're dependent upon the Saudi Arabias, the Russias, and elsewhere that produce, the Irans, the Iraqs, that produce oil, the Venezuelas for that matter, and an America that's dependent upon the world when we have our own resources right here. That's called committing suicide. And as for me, not really inclined to do that. As a country, we shouldn't. So, and November is going to tell the tale. Is the environmentalist agenda, the Green New Deal agenda, going to be persisted? Is it going to prevail or not? But those are questions for you guys to answer. I didn't want to talk about politics today. Just want to talk a little bit about inflation. And I appreciate you all coming in and just joining us. And we will talk to you next time. Thank you very much. This is Rick Manning, Americans for Limited Government, signing off.